Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending our Frameworx this morning. We're going to get started here in just a few minutes. We're letting a few more people into the main session, but we'll first get started with our president and CEO of BioCrossroads, Patty Martin. Just before Patty gets started, I just wanted to remind everyone to turn the chat feature on. We'll be taking questions for all the speakers and the panelists through the chat. So send us any questions you may have, and we'll be sure to get to them while we're doing the show. At any rate, everybody, welcome Patty Martin.
I want to welcome everyone to today's event. As you know, we've been talking about COVID for over a year. In fact, we're coming up on the year anniversary, and we've been highlighting the efforts around vaccinations since last October. So today we're thrilled to have a collaborative Frameworx with folks from one of my peer organizations, Conexus. We've got Mark Howell joining us today. Mark and his team have been doing an extraordinary amount of work in supporting Indiana's efforts to return to work, as well as coordinating the distribution and logistics of the distribution of the vaccination. So we're really delighted to have Mark here. He's a great friend and colleague, and we're really delighted to have him. Today's event, moving from vaccines to vaccinations, actually was triggered to us by a report that was published by PwC by one of our other guests today, Erin McCallister. So Erin, sorry to actually steal your title, but we thought it was great as we move from the science of vaccines to the practical application of vaccinations. So with that, please use your chat, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Erin. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thanks, Patty, for having me and the opportunity to talk about our research at HRI. So just for a little background on the report, which was published last September, about turning vaccines into vaccinations. Last summer, as clinical trials for the COVID-19 vaccines were underway, and we were starting to get distribution of the first therapeutics for COVID-19, PwC's Pharma and Life Science practice wanted to ensure that when and if vaccines become available, the rollout and delivery could be as efficient and equitable as possible. And this meant mapping the journey of the vaccine from the assembly line to consumers' arms, and really working with all the stakeholders involved along the value chain. And the intention, and so in doing this, we convened a team of stakeholders across the value chain to assess this, what is really a complex supply chain, to understand the obstacles as well as the opportunities for industry to begin to address these and make the rollout efficient and equitable. The intention really was to help to, on the next slide, you can see, to avoid the mistakes from the past where with H1N1 supply really couldn't match demand as the vaccines for that infectious disease were rolled out early on. And so our survey of executives last August, which HRI conducted, showed a similar concern, with about 72% of health industry executives saying that demand exceeding supply was a concern. So if you go on to the next slide, in talking with stakeholders across the value chain, distributors, manufacturers, hospitals, pharmacists, and everything in between, we really arrived at three distinct challenges that could be presented with the COVID-19 vaccine, and potential opportunities to address them, with the core issue being that even if we produce hundreds of millions of the most novel and innovative vaccines at a record pace, it would mean very little if the vaccines did not make them into consumer arms, and really turning vaccines into vaccinations. And so on this point, we identified three factors. That's the ultra low temperature transport and storage that some of the vaccines required, that's not typically used for something like a seasonal influenza vaccine. The shifting patient preferences and distancing requirements amid the pandemic, we saw a shift in where patients preferred to get their care. And then finally, the lack or the need for analytics to really illuminate this 360-degree view of the supply chain, to be able to predict demand and consider and take in these consumer preferences. So on the next slide, you can see that when the clinical trials were still underway for some of these vaccines, we had various temperature and storage requirements, different dosing regimens, and multiple factors that really make it clear that a one-size-fits-all approach, the distribution of these vaccines, wasn't going to be possible. And, we sort of, with this need for specialized distribution channels, with the Pfizer vaccine requiring storage at down to minus 80 degrees Celsius, we're really going to have to take a different point of view. Now, since the rollout of that vaccine, Pfizer has developed its own sort of specialized delivery process in distributing its own vaccine with specialized containers to maintain that temperature. And they've been able to work with the FDA to make adjustments to some of the storage and transportation requirements, where the vials can be kept at temperatures that are more typically used with pharmaceuticals. And this allows for storage of the undiluted vials at those more typical temperatures for up to 2 weeks. So we're already seeing some movement on this front, but it did require some adjustments even before the rollout of the vaccine. On the next slide, another factor that was at play, and that is at play as you consider turning vaccines into vaccinations, is really taking into consideration the consumer and really getting that last mile right. What HRI saw through consumer surveys it conducted at the start of the pandemic and then again in September was that individuals had really shifted in their preferences for site of care, where we saw for the first time consumers trying things like at-home care, urgent care clinics, and retail clinics rather than going into the hospital or their primary care office. And so it really comes down to the fact that as the group of those prioritized for the vaccine widens, and we're seeing that right now, consumer preferences will become a bigger factor because there will be more consumers that aren't necessarily interested in visiting a hospital or their primary care office to receive a vaccine. And there needs to be some consideration to models that can accommodate these alternative sites of care, whether it's mobile health providers, retail clinics, and the like. So on the next slide, with all of these complexities, one of the other factors that we considered is the idea of establishing worksite clinics. Some work sites have already taken on a lot of the burden of establishing, 6 feet to maintain social distance, requiring masks, and those seem as though they could be good locations to set up worksite clinics. And in fact, we found that among the healthcare executives that we surveyed last August, that if a COVID-19 vaccine were to become available, that worksite clinics were one of the things that they were considering. Now, these are either healthcare providers considering vaccination clinics in their offices, or even pharmaceutical and life science companies, establishing worksite clinics. And so that was another factor and possibility that as more individuals become eligible and the funnel widens, we could start to, these could become new locales. And we are seeing that to some extent depending on the work site. Finally, on the next slide, given all of the complexities that we've discussed so far, there really was this need to have advanced analytics, being able to connect the dots between the distributors, the vaccinators, and the consumers and their site of care, their preferences. And so this HRI work, talking with these various stakeholders, envision, a system of these advanced analytics as well as an integrated database to account for things such as demand spikes, temperature changes, the shifting in consumer preferences, the shifting criteria of who is eligible And also factors such as social determinants of health, where we've seen that some of the more vulnerable populations in the US have suffered some of the most severe consequences of the pandemic when it comes to hospitalizations and death. And so really being able to factor all this into planning and distribution of the vaccine. So with that, as the backdrop, where are we today? Well, we are about a year from, the pandemic being, a public health emergency. When you look at, we're also about 4 months to the day from when the FDA authorized the Pfizer vaccine. It was on December 11th. And we've made progress on all of these efforts, arguably, with the specialized network for the Pfizer vaccine, as well as being able to move beyond hospital settings for the vaccination of Americans. We've seen mobile clinics deployed in California to reach farm workers and in parts of Maryland to reach some of the more vulnerable populations. According to the Bloomberg tracker for vaccinations, more than 319 million doses have been administered across 118 countries. In the US, we're averaging about 2.1 million doses each day. And we have 3 vaccines that are now authorized by the FDA. They each have different dosing or booster regimens, 21 days, 20 for Moderna, 21 days for Pfizer, 28 days for Moderna, and now the J&J vaccine, which doesn't require any booster follow-up. So we could add at least 1 or 2 more to that mix in the coming months, with companies such as Novavax suggesting that they'll submit an application to the FDA soon. This would also be a 2-shot regimen. According to the Bloomberg data, if you look at the vaccination rate for the US in general, the US rank compared to the global, how other countries are doing, the US ranks 7th in terms of the proportion of its population that it's already vaccinated. Israel has been sort of held up as an example of, achieving a larger proportion of the largest proportion of individuals vaccinated. But if you could look at it in terms of the rate at which the vaccinations are occurring, the US is leading with the 2.1 million doses per day, followed by India and China. And then if you look within the US in terms of how the different states are doing, Indiana has about 17% of its population having received at least the first dose, which is roughly in the middle of the pack based on the Bloomberg numbers. But then if you start to look at who is reported as being fully vaccinated, Indiana is at the higher end of the ranking at around 11%. And so I think that, we've been able to figure out some of the parts and pieces to this puzzle and resulting in some of these data points that I've just highlighted here. So with that, I'll turn it back over.
Hi, Erin. Yes, thank you so much for great information, and again for inspiring us to have this conversation today. Our next guest is, as Patty said, Mark Howell from one of BioCrossroads' sister organizations, Conexus Indiana. Please welcome President and CEO of Conexus Indiana, Mark Howell.
Yeah, thank you, Joe, Beth, and thank you to everybody who's participating. What I think is an incredibly important discussion today. I specifically want to endorse Erin's work because we've had so many learnings over the course of the last year, and the learnings continue to accelerate. You think about the levels of naivety and how much smarter we've gotten in such short periods of time, and the work that Erin has done to kind of capture those learnings, because this won't be the last crisis as a society or as communities that we have to face. And so those people who are taking the time to understand what was successful, I think will create great value to us in the future. I want to thank Patty for her friendship and partnership at CICP, and Joe, Beth, and Erica for putting this on today. I think this is an unbelievably important discussion. And I'm very happy, very honored to be here to represent Conexus, to represent CICP and in the industries of manufacturing and logistics. I think one of the most important themes of today's discussion is this concept of essentiality. And I think we need to really focus on this word essential, that which is absolutely necessary, those things which are extremely important, and maybe how in ourselves, our own definition of this concept of essential has evolved. If we take ourselves back a year ago to March, and we talk about the essential nature of PPE, when most of us didn't really even understand what those three letters stood for, and you had overcrowded ICU units who were on allocation of PPE as an example, and not to be trite, but there were periods of time with toilet paper and hand sanitizers and grocery items when they were becoming essential because they were in short order. The essential nature of broadband, which we didn't fully appreciate a year ago. For the last year, we've lived on broadband, whether it be schooling or working, and how many people did not have access to broadband, and how were they able to do it. Emotional essentiality, I think empathy and patience and those types of things. And it is the journey of the pandemic evolved. I think we're at a point now where we begin to Erin's point, to really focus on the essentiality of vaccines. And it won't stop with vaccines. Today, we have this constraining factor of vaccine availability or capacity. And we're very quickly, I think in less than a month, we're going to go from the vaccine itself being the constraining factor to our distribution capacity being the constraining factor. And then once we solve that problem, then it's going to be penetration and engagement. Everyone who's willing to get a vaccine will have gotten a vaccine, but not everyone who should or needs to. And so we still have problems to solve. I think one of the things, next slide. I think one of the things that's absolutely essential and absolutely necessary and extremely important to Indiana is our manufacturing and logistics sector. And sometimes I think that level of importance and dependency is misunderstood. So I'm going to hopefully frame it in a way that changes the way that you view these sectors. So Indiana is the most manufacturing intensive state in the country, measured both in terms of percentage of workforce and percentage of GDP, and we'll get into that. But there's actually only one state that has a higher single industry concentration than Indiana has in manufacturing, and that's the state of Delaware, and that's in financial services and industry. Financial services and insurance. But to put it into perspective, the entire GDP of the state of Delaware is less than half of Indiana's manufacturing GDP. And from an economic impact measurement, Indiana has a higher dependency on manufacturing than Hawaii has on tourism. And so I think when we think about essentiality, those are things that we should focus on. We've got just an incredibly strong history in that area and highly diversified. We're big in automotive and everybody realized that, but aerospace and defense, pharma, medical devices, industrial manufacturing, the impact of ag on our manufacturing are really, really huge. And what we do in Indiana very much impacts the world. We talk about medical devices that change lives, pharma that saves lives, the impact we have on the world's food supply chain, the impact on transportation, both air and automotive is very, very significant and incredibly essential. And I think we demonstrated that. I think on the next slide, just to talk about maybe some of the numbers that support that concept. When we look at this, I talked about being number one in manufacturing intensity in two ways that we can measure that. When we think about our geographic proximity, we think about the infrastructure of this state, whether it's inland waterways, whether it's the Burns Harbor Port, the most pass-through highways of any state, two-day ground to more than 50% of the population of the U.S. and because of that, almost 2 times the GDP of our state passes through our state. And that's why our logistics and distribution and supply chain sectors are so critically important. Another thing that's often lost is within these sectors the importance of the workforce component. So 25% of our workforce is in manufacturing and logistics. The wages are higher than any other sectors. Logistics by 20%, manufacturing by 30%, and very opportunistic. Really, with the manufacturing sector being the technology and the logistics sector being the technology sectors of the future. We talk about our unemployment rate, which spiked during the shutdown, but is again back to extremely low rates. We have 100,000 unfilled jobs today in manufacturing, and in a workforce of almost 600,000 in those sectors, a third of which will reach retirement age by 2030. And so the criticality of deploying technologies to mitigate that impact, as well as filling the top of the talent funnel, preparing workers for roles in these careers are extremely important and pose potentially our greatest risk. If we're not successful in deploying technologies and filling talent funnels, that will create the biggest threat to Indiana's manufacturing logistics competitiveness. So on the next slide, I'll turn to Conexus quickly and kind of our role in that. But we partner with several groups, philanthropy, the public sector, industry partners, education, really to optimize the manufacturing and logistics sectors, and we really do that not as an economic development organization. We do it as a human being development organization, and manufacturing and logistics just happens to be the biggest lever that can impact people's lives in Indiana, and it's our best jobs, the biggest contributor to our economy. So you think at the individual level, the dignity of work, meaningful, purposeful jobs, really good incomes, aspirational and opportunities for prosperity, access to continuing education, paid time off, employer-sponsored healthcare, mechanisms for long-term security through savings programs or retirement plans. All those elements are necessary to create a better life at an individual level. But from a community level, manufacturing and logistics also provide us our greatest opportunities to increase our tax base, improve our quality of place, and for growth. I mean, you look at communities in Batesville with Hillenbrand, in Princeton with Toyota, it's Steel Dynamics at Fort Wayne. You look at the impact that the manufacturing base and its supplier network can impact community is most significant. So on the next slide, you can see if that's who we were, kind of a company built around education and built around convenings and all of those sort of things. We hit the same wall last mid-March that everybody else did. I can remember having a meeting with our leadership team, and in that meeting was how are we going to fill people's times for the next 2 weeks until we come back into the office. And we weren't even sure there was kind of 2 weeks worth of out of office work to be done, much less a year's worth. And so we contemplated contingency plans regarding reductions in force, or how do we reduce our budgets, and how do we tap the brakes and suspend some of our programming. But as you'll see on the next slide, we with the public sector, we with the IDC, we with leaders in our industry were actually put into a position to have what I believe was a very, very significant impact on Indiana's very, very effective response to the global pandemic. I think the way that we responded was in many ways indicative of kind of the Hoosier spirit in how we collectively responded to this. And in many ways, Conexus's journey kind of mapped the journey of the pandemic. And I'm going to touch just on 4 areas where Conexus played a leadership role in partnership with philanthropy, in partnership with the educational community, in partnership with the public sector, and in partnership with other non-governmental organizations around the state to mitigate the impact of what was happening to us. And in these 4 areas, I kind of think of them as seasons of the year, and these are, very loose metaphors, so apologize. But the first thing we do is if we go back to like the first few months of the global pandemic, everything was about PPE and sourcing PPE for hospitals, nursing homes, and essential industries. And I think of that as the fall. Things were getting worse before they were getting better. Days were getting shorter. Things were getting darker. And moods were getting tougher. And then we moved into the winter of the pandemic, which was our darkest hour, just in terms of hospitalization rates, infection rates, people dying from these diseases, impact on young people in education. And that's when Conexus pivoted its work to PPE logistics and how do we take all those things that we have learned to accumulate and get them into the right hands of the right people? And then we moved into a period that we think of as the spring, when we began to see a light at the end of the tunnel, and there was actually a contemplation of coming out of our houses and getting back into the workplace. And we led an effort on safe return to work, and I'll touch on that. And then the last piece, kind of where we're at now, is the longer days, the brighter sun, the warmer temperatures, and that's vaccine distribution not being the end, but what Churchill would have referred to as the beginning of the end, and that's where we're now. So on the next slide, I'll just talk briefly in terms of PPE sourcing while we can. As I mentioned earlier, hospitals, healthcare workers were on allocation of these critical products, and the IEDC and Luke Bosso and others took a very strong leadership role in solving that problem quickly. And it was an Everest. It was an Everest to be climbed. But what Conexus was able to do is went out and we fielded a survey of more than 14,000 contacts for actual completed PPE and 400 contacts for material providers, and vetted and qualified those and got them down to a very manageable 20-25 suppliers for the state's PPE, in about 10 or 12 suppliers of materials for manufacturing there. But just sources of PPE, for example, our mining industry, all of their fire protection equipment was repurposed to PPE. Novelty companies with face masks, funeral homes who had certain materials that would be helpful. And in the process of identifying these suppliers and identifying these sources, the IEDC was literally able to obtain tens of millions of pieces of PPE. And this overwhelming concept of shortage of PPE kind of quickly went away late in the spring, as we remember. On the next slide, we took on another project where there was a lot of what I would call would be pivoting of legacy manufacturing to do things that they hadn't done before. And there are lots of examples of those. What General Motors did with ventilator manufacturing in Kokomo, what Cummins did with masks, what the Fisher Group did with N95 masks. And one of the things that Conexus did in that regard is, because a lot of the ventilator technology is open source technology, we convened a group that included LHS Engineering down in Columbus, Rose-Hulman Ventures in Terre Haute, some of Conexus's subject matter experts, and began designing in the feasibility of us becoming our own contract manufacturer for Indiana to leverage our existing supplier base, our existing manufacturing infrastructure, and produce our own ventilators. The conclusion was ventilator production had gotten out ahead of us, and it wasn't worthwhile, but that was a conscious decision and not a responsive decision. The next project, again, is we moved into the winter on the next slide, was PPE logistics. So once you've accumulated, tens of millions of pieces of PP equipment, how do you get that to tens of thousands of end user locations across the state? When you think about the number of nursing homes, the number of health clinics and wellness clinics, and other small and medium-sized businesses who didn't have access to things like latex gloves, face shields, sanitizers, or masks. So I know we're going to hear from Langham, but I want to give a big shout out to Langham and the work that they did as the primary partner in order to receive, organize, kit, order management, and distribute. I think probably 10 plus million pieces of protective equipment around the state. So the Indiana logistics community, supply community, transportation, warehousing, kitting, fulfillment, and logistics accelerated our ability to keep safer work environments. In the spring of the pandemic, on the next slide, we turned our work to a safe return to work playbook. And there's so many things now that we take for granted. We didn't use the expression social distancing. We didn't understand why it was 6 feet, not 3 feet or 8 feet. We didn't think about mobile-based apps that did attestations or temperature checks at the door, automated walk-through temperature checks, or how do we manage break rooms and close down water coolers and handle restrooms and do contact tracing and all of these things. So Conexus was very fortunate to get together to work with a group that turned out to be 128 participants, covering the state geographically, covering our sectors, covering subject matter expertise, led by Andrew Pinkett Cummins and John Enneking at Cook Medical. We actually did 70 drafts of the Safe Return to Work playbook, and so many things that we take for granted today, the basics of shields and masking and those sort of things, were all kind of revolutionary at the time. And we were able to very quickly get our Safe Return to Work playbook out onto the IED's website, which I think accelerated the ability for people to get back to work. And then bringing us up to the current, speaking about, vaccine distribution, is I mentioned, if we can go to the next slide, as I mentioned earlier, we operated in an area where the vaccine itself was the constraining factor. We had 200 clinics across the state where the vaccine could be distributed. The state did what I think was a really bold and brave decision to let science determine who and when people are going to get vaccinated, purely based on hospitalization and morbidity rates. And we've won praises for that decision and the effectiveness of that decision. But now, as we open up those eligibility requirements, and is was mentioned by Patty earlier, is the vaccine quantities begin to accelerate, it's no longer going to be the 50 to 75 to 115,000 first doses a week. But when that comes at scale, the next controlling factor is going to be distribution capacity. We had 17,000 at the Motor Speedway in 4 days this weekend, but we have 6 million citizens. So, how can we increase that distribution capacity? So we've set up, Conexus has set up a working group of 14 companies, again, geographically dispersed. Indiana has 300 companies with more than 1,000 employees, with the wellness infrastructure that Erin discussed about worksite vaccination clinics, not just for their employees, but for their contractors, for their suppliers and their customers. A lot of these are big companies and small communities, so the impact that they can have on their communities themselves. And these companies have been working very hard for 3 months as pilots, hoping to launch at the end of this month or early next month as mass vaccination clinics with an eligibility hierarchy that can then quickly be scaled across these 286 companies with more than 1,000 employees. And then kind of sticking to that, the last thing I'll talk about in terms of work is what we're doing on a return to work task force on the next slide. On that slide, we've kind of reached the conclusion that it's actually easier to return to work in a quarantined environment where we know the rigidity of the rules. You know, in manufacturing logistics, safety is so big and people are rule followers. It becomes much less difficult to return to work in what we call a hybrid environment, vaccinated and unvaccinated, and what rules apply within that workplace in that new environment. So there's a 23-member task force being led by ICP, currently meeting twice a month, and the goal will be to find those best practices, document them, vet them, and share them to the rest of the state so that we can most effectively and most quickly get back into the workplace and continue to be safe at a time when we know that everybody isn't immunized and vaccinated, and that we also haven't reached a level of herd immunity. So on my last slide, just quickly to mention some big learnings from this. You know, very, very proud of the leadership across the board in the state, in the way that we were able to move so quickly. Very proud of our industries and their adaptability, and the people who work for those companies and their acceptance of much more difficult working environments, the resiliency of our supply chains, the output, the productivity, and our effectiveness there. And then the agility that we've seen from so many companies to pivot, Fisher and Langham and Cummins, all and Mercix, all being great examples of that. Much to be proud of and much to carry forward. I kind of started out with this concept of essentiality, you know, that which is most necessary, most important, absolute. And we all have a much different definition of essentiality than maybe we did a year ago. But I think one thing that continues to be essential, this isn't over and we will face new crises, but I think one thing that's absolutely essential is that we not forget how unbelievably effective in Indiana the alignment and collaboration between the private sector, the public sector, the education community, organizations like CICP and WIN, and others in the healthcare community, how much can be accomplished when we're all completely aligned and pulling in the same direction. So very, very proud of Conexus. I'm very, very proud of the industry sectors that we represent. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was great effort on Conexus Indiana's part and just leading the charge of collaboration. So thank you again, Mark Howell. Our next guest, as Mark mentioned, is Jeff James from Langham Logistics. Please welcome the Director of Life Science Services, Jeff James.
Thank you so much, Jo Beth. Appreciate the introduction. Did want to take a quick opportunity to thank Patty as well and BioCrossroads for the opportunity. We're delighted to be here. Mark, thank you so much for recognizing the efforts that have been displayed by Langham Logistics, as you mentioned. I'm by no means the one to be recognized for that. For sure, there are others that I consider. When you see the signs that say heroes work here, I think of the folks at Langham, like Leanne Merriman and Nick Hoagland and Rick Reedinger, who really are to be recognized for everything they did to help pull together a lot of the logistics efforts with regard to PPE logistics. So, but thank you so much. It's been quite an effort, and for sure, coming on the heels of 1 year as of tomorrow that we've officially stated that COVID has become an overarching theme in everything we talk about. It's been quite a journey. So, you know, I'm reminded of our president and CEO, Kathy Langham, always reminds us, hey, you have to celebrate the wins. So I look at this as an opportunity to celebrate some of the wins. So we'll go through some things we've been doing over the past year, and we'll also talk about some of the challenges with vaccine distribution. My background specifically is in vaccine distribution. I have 13 years experience with Merck and Company, where I had the pleasure of being responsible for their bulk distribution of vaccines out of their facility in the U.S. So I've come to realize some of the challenges associated with distributing vaccines, and a lot of those challenges really reside at the inoculation point, managing and making sure that you're retaining efficacy of the vaccine prior to putting it into a child's arm or an adult's arm it's really critical. And there's a lot that goes into it in the industry to make sure that happens successfully. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So you can go to the next slide. Thanks, Jo Beth. So just real quick, just want to go over a couple things. I just want to make sure we talk about, an overview of the role we had in COVID-19 testing and vaccine distribution for IDH specifically. We'll talk about ULTs. You may be hearing this word. Erin alluded to it. Ultra low storage and ultra low temperature storage and transportation is really the thing that's creating a lot of the technical complications, or at least challenges with regard to vaccinations and distribution of vaccines. We'll talk a little bit about that. PPE overflow. These are some of the things we've been doing in the last year specific to Langham Logistics and supporting the IDH efforts for getting people tested and rolling out vaccination programs. And of course, I do want to take some time. I'll just recognize some of the partnerships that we've had that have been specific to Indiana companies and their contribution to really pulling this off. We could not have done any of this on our own. We've relied on a lot of partnerships. We've actually formed a lot of new partnerships just as a result of being involved with these opportunities and the efforts around the vaccination programs for Indiana. And you can go to the next slide. Great, thank you. So this is, just want to take a quick second to show you really what the numbers, right, as they say. So, there's a lot of data out there. We have a lot of data. There's a lot that's been shared. When you take a look at what's really been happening with regard to shipments of PPE to schools for IDOE, Indiana Department of Health, 2,270 COVID testing materials and PPE shipments for the hospitals, the jails, the schools, 2,000 plus specimen shipments delivered to state labs. So that's specimens coming back to the labs for testing, for COVID testing. Sanitizer. So we have an IDOH frontline effort now that's basically a portal so that companies can go, Indiana businesses can go in and order sanitizer and masks. We've been supporting those efforts most recently. The IDOH local mobile refers to the cleaning products shipments to the mobile testing and vaccination sites. Over 66 of those different locations have been served. Close to 32,000 PPE and sanitizer shipments to Indiana businesses at the start of COVID. Mark made a reference to this in the beginning. What is PPE? It's hard to understand until you actually see these materials coming in 4 times 1 gallon jugs of hand sanitizer and boxes upon boxes of gowns, masks, gloves, and maintaining order on that and making sure that those are going out in good condition and making sure they're being able to be used by those who need them. More than 10,000 pallets is what that really equates to in testing materials for storage and distribution. So you can see it's an enormous effort. Again, we relied on a lot of partners, a lot of internal resources to pull a lot of this off, and we're still in the throes of this now. So, and we're now transitioning to really supporting the vaccination rollout as well, and that's taking us a forefront of our focus at this time. So, and you can go to the next slide, Jo Beth. So just for a second, I want to talk a little bit about what ULTs are. I know there's been some questions about that. I want to make sure that we're able to demonstrate what goes into actually providing a vaccine and storing that vaccine so that it maintains its efficacy at the site at where it's going to be distributed. So a lot of the state hospitals specifically are managing their own vaccination programs. One of the things that we have been doing to help support those efforts with coordination through Dr. Christine Bach's team, the Division of Emergency Preparedness, Megan Lytle, Kylie Huntington. They have specifically been working with us in a partnership to make sure that ultra low temperature storage is available at those locations, such that when the vaccines arrive at those hospitals, they have validated storage containment and solutions that are all ready to go, powered on at temperature, so that they can put product into those storage environments, make sure that they stay cold for when they need to be administered. I just broke down here real quickly. I know Erin went into this a little bit, but I just wanted to show you what it means to be able to store or have to store a material. The BioNTech Pfizer candidate for COVID-19 has to be stored at -70°C for up to 6 months. Not many folks are used to dealing with a -70°C vaccine, as Erin had alluded to before. We're typically seeing or used to a vaccine that's refrigerated, shipped cold, as they say. And really the reasons behind why you're seeing some of these really what we'll call extreme temperatures is because right now the manufacturers, they don't have the stability profiles they need to be able to justify that the material, that the vaccine can stay efficacious for an extended amount of time outside of those conditions. So they're taking kind of the high road, if you will. They're really hedging, they're risk mitigating, and they're requiring storage conditions that are typically more extreme than what we're used to for a vaccine storage prior to being delivered to a patient. Certainly presents challenges for distribution. Keeping something at -70°C when it's on the road essentially means dry ice. You have to understand how to manage a vaccine in dry ice, be able to take it from its packaging and put it into a validated storage. And it takes education, and it takes an understanding of being efficient and having a process around doing that. So the Moderna vaccine, again, -20°C for 6 months. It can be maintained at 2°C to 8°C for 30 days. That's relatively short time. So if you move it into refrigerated condition, you have to use it in 30 days. The Pfizer vaccine is only 5 days at 2 to 8°C currently. Now, you're also hearing in the news, they are transitioning. So Moderna specifically recently announced that you're going to be able to maintain that 2 to 8°C condition for longer than 30 days. That's because as the vaccination rollouts are continuing, they're starting to get more data about the efficacy of that vaccine. They're showing stability for longer times at higher temperatures, and they're able to pass that on now to the industry and to the end users. So, and that's really the ultimate goal, is to ensure that this highest level of efficacy in that vaccine is ensured for the patients. Right now, we're up to 20. I'm sorry, I didn't want to skip over the J&J vaccine. Is shipping at -20°C, but you're probably hearing a lot about the ability to keep it at 2 to 8°C for 3 months, which offers a great opportunity to be able to store it in conditions that are really already pretty prominent in a lot of clinics, physician sites, hospitals. They have 2 to 8°C more readily than they will -20, -70 conditions. Right now, we're at 22 ULTs to state hospitals. We have distributed them. That program includes delivering those ultra low temperature storage environments, which are basically upright freezers, if you've seen them, and then validating them, providing validation services to ensure that when that freezer comes in, it's operating correctly. It's then validated to ensure it's going to operate correctly, and that it's holding the temperature that it's expected to be able to maintain the efficacy of the product. So, and this is a huge, I mean, this effort, I can't understate how much coordination goes into working with IDH on a daily basis to make sure, and the hospitals directly, to make sure they know and understand when there will be delivery of a ULT. When do we plan to be there to be able to do the validation? It's a huge effort, and we really do applaud the efforts of the IDH specifically on coordinating this with us. There's a lot of folks that help on a daily basis, and if you go to the next slide there, Joe Beth. So just wanted to go through real quickly here. This is just a quick snapshot of what we did with the COVID-19 PPE program. This is really just a timeline showing what has happened since April of last year, really probably started at the end of March. to get to where we are now and transitioning into supporting the vaccination rollout. So it's been a lot of coordination, and there's definitely been trials with regard to transitioning into different aspects of the supply of the program and providing the PPE that's been more desired and been more needed, and as well evolving our own GMP program specifically at Langham to be able to manage the test kits, specifically the vaccines specifically. Doesn't happen overnight. There's a lot of licensing that goes in. There's a lot of SOP writing. There's a lot of developing and validating equipment to be able to ensure that you're doing this in compliance with regulatory expectations. So it's been a success, and that's the good story. If you could go to the next one, Joe Beth. Just wanted to take 1 second here to just recognize, Mark brought up before the fact that we're relying on a lot of local partnerships, a lot of local Indiana companies. We have developed a number of relationships just at Langham in order to be able to facilitate and be able to pull off, if you will, being able to have vaccine storage available at the hospitals, be able to ensure that we have clear line of sight with regard to chain of custody for vaccine delivery. There's a lot that goes into that. We make sure we partner with people who have proficiency, expertise. All of these are local. The BPM Associates has been instrumental in helping us in coordinating our quality management system, doing the validations of the ULTs in the field. You wouldn't think about it, but we have backup power at Langham Logistics in the form of emergency generators to make sure that the freezers, if we ever lose house power, we've got power to those units. We're relying on local providers for some of those, for that power and those emergency generators. Polar Leasing, Cold Box Express, these are all great partners that have provided us with solutions for moving vaccines and moving test kits and storing them at required temperatures. Another local courier has been instrumental in getting all the PPE and materials to the test site specifically on a daily basis. Just a great reliance on some of the local companies for providing equipment and services, and it just goes to show that it takes a huge effort just to get this kind of program off the ground and be successful.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff, and for your efforts at Langham. We really appreciate it and appreciate you sharing with us today. So our next guest is Mark Isenberg, and Mark is with Zotec Partners. If you've had a vaccine or you've signed up for a vaccine, you've interfaced with Mark's company for sure. So please welcome Mark Isenberg, the Executive Vice President of Healthcare Advocacy for Zotec Partners.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be part of this discussion. And I thank everyone for putting it together. I guess the way to think about Zotec Partners is that once everyone else on this call has done their job and the vaccine gets to the locations, there's a real logistical problem and a patient-facing problem on how to get them to schedule and register to get to the vaccine. And so our relationship began with the Department of Health around the same time as Langham's, about a year now into this process, and we're a revenue cycle company in the healthcare space. So we really do medical billing and kind of patient experience in terms of how do you interact with the patient in order to get them to schedule a visit, and then conversely, how do you get them to pay their bill and all of the communication that goes back and forth between our clients and their patients. And we had just recently finished an implementation with Walmart Health, whereby Walmart is opening up clinics in a lot of their locations. They're on the growth path right now to have it be primarily, almost all of them at some point in time, where they can deliver primary care services, dental, vision, etc., lab work. And we created the patient experience that allowed them to have one application sit on top of their entire platform and integrate and talk to their corresponding EMRs. So we had one for dental, we had one for vision, we had one for labs. And so we utilized APIs and HL7 messaging in order to accommodate that for Walmart Health. We had just finished those implementations when this crisis was starting. And Scott Law, our CEO and founder, said, "Hey, Mark, reach out to the city or to the state and see if there's anything that we can help do with regards to testing." Immediately got on the phone with them for the testing side of the equation and walked through just the logistics of what they do throughout that testing process and what was all involved with it. And the reality of it was that it was extremely antiquated and very paper-based. They would really be writing things down by hand and then manually typing it in order to create an entry into the LIMSnet system, which is the lab system. I know Lilly was actually jumping in early and doing a lot of the testing, and they were experiencing trouble with identifying which specimen belonged to which patient. So we mapped out in short order, about 2 or 3 weeks, a process whereby we would be able to take in the order, if you will, create a barcode, allow that barcode to be then put on the specimen and then scanned in so that we were sure that the results we were giving for Mark Isenberg were in fact Mark Isenberg's, and set up a completely paperless process, thereby allowing not only the State Department of Health, but also the local health departments to be able to set up testing, remote testing locations across the state. As I mentioned, we did this in very short order. There was integration with the LIMSnet system. And one thing we're very proud of is that because it was done remotely and you could do it from the comfort of your own home, you could enter in all of your information and then just simply show up, show an ID, do the test, and then leave right away. And what that enabled us to do was, as a state, was not to have as much face-to-face contact with people sitting around waiting to get tested. They knew exactly what time they were going to be seen, when they were going to be seen, and they were in and out of that process. So fast forward, we thought we might have a little bit of time on the vaccine side of the equation to mirror what we did with the testing. And actually, we're starting off with just your standard flu vaccine to see how that might work with deployment into local health departments. And really only did it for, I think we did maybe 9 or 10 immunizations on the flu. And then thankfully, the vaccine for COVID became available, and we had to pivot to focus more on that application. And so on the, as everyone has appropriately applauded the state's rollout, they had a very visionary strategy where a system, the Zotec system, if you would sit on top of all of these locations. And right now, I believe there are about 1,400 locations across the state, either doing testing or vaccine currently. And from that took away all the interoperability challenges that would exist if you were just simply going to give the vaccine to the health systems, allow their EMR to process it, in fighting with that exchange of information. So they had the wherewithal to contemplate this system and take control over it, which I think has helped tremendously. But some of the challenges that we have overcome and faced, we have a scheduling and registration system that's great, but then we find out that you have 2 different vaccines, but one with the 21-day period for the second dose, one with the 28-day, and now one with just 1 dose. So how do you account for that in the schedule? If you have 100 if you have 100 blocks of schedule open, you want to be sure that you're holding back some of those for the second dose, so that you can make sure that you hit the window necessary for the second dose and you haven't filled them all up with the first dose. We also had challenges with snowbirds. What if somebody got their first one in Florida? How do we know which one it was? How do we verify which one it was? And so from those challenges were significant and very difficult to overcome. But what we did was we created a throttling system that allowed the Department of Health to know and to hold back certain appointments so that they could make sure that people were getting in for their second dose and not being shut out, which has been very helpful. And I think referenced earlier in terms of those that have completed their vaccine as a percentage, Indiana ranks higher because that was a very focused effort that the Department of Health really wanted to focus on, to be sure that those that were at most vulnerable were able to get their full vaccination before opening it up for others who were less vulnerable. Some of the other things that we were dealing with are very real and scary problems, at least from my perspective. When we first started opening it up, the demand was so great, and you read about sites crashing across the board. New York, I think California had one, but the announcement and then the sheer volume of people banging on that application had tremendous challenges because it's all one application, and if the scheduling and registration shut down, then all of the logistical administration of the vaccines would shut down as well. So we had to pivot and come up with a virtual waiting page, if you will, that said, we know what volume we can handle, and we continually work on being able to handle more volume. But if that volume were to get to the point where it was potentially going to crash the system, we would kick people out into this virtual waiting room and tell them how long they had until they were able to schedule their appointment. So that was a very big challenge and has worked very well going forward. We have roughly 30,000 users in the state of Indiana that thankfully are actually checking in patients and vaccinating patients. We had to accommodate for mobile vaccine sites, mass vaccine sites. I think, as mentioned, 17,000 at IMS. There's going to be another one this weekend down in Sellersburg, and I believe one up in Gary and then in South Bend as well. So just making sure that our application was able to handle that many users at that period of time. We also then had to create certifications. So if you finished your vaccination through us, you have an electronic certification saying which vaccine it was, the date you were finally vaccinated, so that you could then show that to employers as well. One thing that the state also did, which I thought was very ingenious, is and it hasn't been well publicized except for those that have been involved in the conversations, they focused in on what they're calling a special population, and those are those that have those morbidities, comorbidities that they would benefit most from getting the vaccine, but have yet hit the age requirement. So we worked with providers to have them, they're inputting this information into a portal at the Department of Health. We then get a daily export of those participants. We text and email them out a link that allows them to kind of bypass all of the attestation and basically allows them to schedule right away. So as they're moving down in age, they're also intertwining invitations that allow folks to get their vaccines when they can. So it's been a very conscious effort that has proven very successful. We've to date scheduled 2.4 million vaccine appointments. I believe 1.7 of those have been completed. And we continue to whittle down on the age group in terms of who's eligible. And just to give you an idea, today, even though it's not publicized because those special populations are actually scheduling. As of noon today, we've scheduled 14,000 across the state of Indiana today. Typical day when there's no major announcements is anywhere between 30 and 40. And on days when major announcements happen, we can get up to 250,000 appointments scheduled over probably an 8 to 10 hour period. I would like to also give a shout out to the Department of Health, Paul Crevens, Megan, Dr. Weaver, Dr. Box. We get together every day at 4 o'clock, sometimes over the weekend as well, just to debrief and to strategize on when the next age drop is going to be, making sure that we're prepared for that. But they have worked tirelessly to get this under control. And I think that the most gratifying thing I've heard is unsolicited advice of people who don't even know where I work. Just say, man, it was so easy to get an appointment scheduled. And when I got there, I waited 2 minutes and then got my arm and I got the injection, and then sat the 15 minutes. I was able to schedule my second appointment right there. And then I was out the door. So it's been great to be a small part in what I'm hopeful everyone can understand is a huge mobilization of both private and public sector in order to get everyone back to work. We're optimistic that we'll continue to whittle through the ages, and I do think by the end of May, anyone who wants a vaccine will be able to get a vaccine. The one thing that we're now starting to look at is the health equality and making sure that we are hitting those populations. So because we've been able to mobilize that effort and not have it be paper-based, that local health departments are able to go to churches, or they're able to go to factories, or they're able to go to other areas and actively address that concern. There are also opportunities on working with companies whereby we can ingest their employee roster and then send out text messages or emails and allow them to know that there are going to be opportunities to be vaccinated these 2 days through this period of time. So it's been a great challenge, and happy to have been part of it. We also needed to provide them some visibility into what we were seeing in terms of who was getting vaccinated, who wasn't getting vaccinated. The most recent request is tell us by ethnicity and by area or by zip code who came to IMS over the weekend. Of those 17,000, were they all Central Indiana, or do we have people from all over the state make the journey in order to get that vaccine? It turns out while it was heavily focused Central Indiana, there were pretty much every county was represented with somebody making that drive to IMS to actually get that J&J vaccine. So again, thank you for your participation in this. It's been a heavy lift, and I'm thankful for all of the partners who are on this call.
Thank you, Mark, for all that great information, for all Zotec is doing to help get everybody vaccinated. We really appreciate that at BioCrossroads for sure. While we're turning on cameras and getting everyone, all of our speakers lined up for the panel, we're going to take a quick poll. So you'll see a polling question pop up. Do you plan or have you already received the COVID-19 vaccine? This is just for purpose of the discussion today, so we'd love to have your feedback. And with that, I'll ask all the panelists and speakers to turn on their microphones and video, and we'll get started with the panel discussion. Great, 91%. That's really good. So we'll get started with the panel discussion, Erin, whenever you're ready.
Sure. Yeah, no, thanks everyone for participating, and really insightful comments, and exciting to hear what you're all doing. Just really quick before we move on to the questions about, sort of what's next and how do we build on this. Mark, I'm just wondering if you can just remind us in general what Zotec Partners does when they're not scheduling people for vaccines.
Sure. So we are, it's called revenue cycle management, which is a glorified way of saying medical billing. We actually bill for, let's say you go to St. Vincent's and you have the anesthesiologist, we would submit the bill on behalf of the anesthesiologist to the carrier and then all the way through to the patient. So that's one line of business. And then we also have more of a software side, whereby I was explaining with Walmart, where we serve as the intermediary between their patients and all of their systems. So we kind of bring that together for them. Because everyone has you have a different EMR for the labs, you have one for, for eye, for dental, for all of those different. And so when we're scheduling, we have to make sure that we're connecting with all of those to make sure that everyone's on the same page.
Got it. Very interesting. Great. And so when we think about, all of these things that we've learned and adapted as a result of the pandemic, what would you say, and I'll start with Jeff, what would you say is the most valuable lesson that you've learned through this process?
Oh, great question. You can hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Most likely the fact that your best effort is definitely with regard to including as many people who have experience and taking into consideration those experiences in order to ensure success. There's just not one single answer that's going to get you to being able to pull off something this complex without taking into consideration a number of backgrounds, experiences. It's really been eye-opening, to be honest with you.
Right now, that's interesting. And Mark, Howell, are you, what do you think, are the most valuable lesson from where you sit?
I mean, at a more ethereal level, I think it's that we've surprised ourselves of what we're actually capable of. I mean, just the amazing timeline that the vaccine itself was distributed, or the pace with which we were able to resume operations or to greater or lesser extents, people's ability to adapt to work from home environments or remote learning environments. I think if we would have been asked to put together a project plan to do what we've done in the last 12 months, the timeline would have been 5 to 7 years or 3 to 5 years or something. So I hope it increases each of our own expectations of ourselves, of our public sector, of the companies that we work for, on what we're actually capable of doing.
Great. Yeah, no. And then Mark Isenberg, I mean, thinking about sort of, just kind of pivoting off of what you mentioned that Zotec does with EMRs and medical billing, and what you've done here with the vaccine scheduling and testing, I guess taking all that together, what do you think is the most valuable lesson for your business?
Oh, I mean, I think it's the willingness of people to jump in. I mean, when this hit everyone a year ago, myself included, everyone wanted to figure out what they could do to help, and being part of this project actually helped me get through the pandemic, because I was so busy I didn't really have time to really even think about what was going on. But people's sheer willingness to jump in and to try to solve a problem, and I got to hand it to the state. They know what they're good at, and they know what they're not good at, and so they're not afraid to admit that they're not sure what is the best direction. And once you start having a collaborative effort with them where they say, okay, here's what I'm trying to solve, can you guys help us strategize on the best way to solve it, became a far more manageable working relationship than having it be kind of, here's what you need to do. We were able to talk through the logistics and make sure that it was going to be successful.
Great. Yeah. So I'm hearing a lot of, getting the right people at the table, and this need, collaboration and jumping in. So if you think about that in the context of your business model going forward, I guess, how do you think about using these lessons to improve upon that? Jeff, maybe?
Sure, appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. And I can point to some things that I have seen. Well, here's what I anticipate anyway, I would say. We've really changed the landscape the last year in a lot of ways, right? Mark made reference to how we work, how we learn, how our children learn. I think more specific, we've changed the landscape regarding the expectation around development of life-saving therapies. We're going to want them faster. It's not going to go back to the 3-4 year development cycles that we have been used to and seen. Those days are done. So I think, just from a distribution perspective and managing vaccines as it relates to this particular discussion, we can expect that we're going to need to become better experts at managing in this kind of an environment. Gosh, I hope it's not like it was the last year forever, but it is going to be more similar to that, from an actual introduction of therapies and rollout of therapies and bringing them to patients. And I think that's the thing. The collaboration doesn't end. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great point. 3 to 4 years of what it used to be. That's optimistic. Feels like it's a lot longer for some therapies, but yeah, no, that's a great point. And so, Mark Isenberg, I'm wondering, when you think about with Zotec in terms of the lessons learned, from this, I guess, how would you envision, implementing that going forward, or how will that change your business going forward?
Well, I mean, the whole work environment's interesting. We picked a terrible time to build a headquarters, because now no one wants to go back to work. But we're trying to figure out how best to accommodate that for our workforce. But I think, as I look over at the whole macro of what, if you think of telehealth and you think of the emergence of telehealth as a result of this pandemic, all of our clients, because they cut on elective procedures, had about a 20 to 60% drop in visit revenue as a result of this pandemic for probably about 90 to 120 days. And oftentimes they would supplement that with the telehealth, but even more so, just thinking about the mobilization of the local health departments and the inventory and the information they have. I mean, for example, if I needed to if the state came to me and said, look, there's a booster shot for Pfizer, I need you to text out every single person who had a Pfizer vaccine. With technology, I can do that in a matter of an hour. And every single person would know that there's a booster, that it's available. Here's a link. They can go ahead and they can schedule it. But that also goes down into the, to the underserved areas. We now have cell phone numbers for almost all of them. 700,000 people got a test at one of these mobile sites. Oftentimes they're resistant to want to take a vaccine. There's an education platform now that can be used in order to communicate with them. So we're thinking about more of how to utilize that and how the state could utilize that to help, reduce the overall cost of healthcare, because prevention and vaccines are our main driver of that. And if anything that we can do to help utilizing our technology is something that we're focused on.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That would be really interesting to see that move forward. And Mark Howell, one of the questions we got from the audience is, what has Indiana done or learned, I guess, from the vaccine storage, handling, and distribution that might be different from other states, good or bad?
Well, I just want to echo the part that Mark shared about the state making really smart decisions about where they have expertise and where they don't, and being willing to reach out and form public-private partnerships with companies like Zotec and Langham in order to optimize their likelihood of success. So I think that was one big thing that we learned. I think the other thing that they've done, and I've really seen this from the IEDC, and I think it's brilliant on their part. We ran a live experience for a year on the resiliency of our supply chains and all of our critical industries. And so I think the other thing that they're doing well is really beginning to understand and very purposely identifying places where we can leverage strengths that we didn't fully appreciate, but more importantly, identify areas where we either have weaknesses or threats that need to be mitigated. And I think we want to be a first mover in those efforts.
Great. Yeah. Do you see any, given sort of what Indiana has learned, do you see, like, going forward, opportunities for Indiana to really build on, all of these things, that you mentioned at the top of the discussion in terms of, what they've learned and what that means next for the next chapter of the industry?
Well, at the risk of Patty being upset with me, on June 18th, we're hosting an event on June 18th, and it's all about supply chain resiliency. And the person who's run Walmart's global supply chain and is now a professor at MIT is going to come and speak to the group. We have a lot of great speakers, because I do think it's an opportunity for economic development. I think it's an opportunity to increase our competitiveness. And because of the very current alignment between philanthropy, the private sector, and the public sector about this need for supply chain resiliency, I think we have a head start that we're going to take advantage of.
Great. So last question, kind of lightning round here. Maybe put your forecasting hat on. Mark Isenberg first. What's the next big challenge or hurdle?
Well, yeah, I think it's not to think that we're not going to have to deal with this again, and not to just assume that one May comes around that there aren't going to be boosters, or there's not going to be another COVID crisis somewhere down the line. And I think governments oftentimes have a propensity to solve a problem and then move on to the next problem. But I think if we can be cognizant of keeping infrastructure, if you will, on a shelf that can be readily available, is something that would help mitigate future issues along these lines.
Great. Yeah. Jeff?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, somewhat similar to what Mark mentioned, but it's along the lines more around the technology, if you will. You saw really a very rapid response from technology sector with regard to solutioning for obviously what has become quickly a major issue, pandemic, essentially. That kind of cycle it's going to be, so here is a perfect example. we've created a lot of storage environments for the likes of a -70 vaccine. What's going to happen with some of those assets as that goes on? Will they still be needed? What will you do with that? Repurposing, things of that nature. I think there's going to be a huge focus on how we do that smarter in the future.
Sure. Great. Yeah. Cell and gene therapies are stored at -70, -80 for some of them. So throw that out there. But great. And then Mark Howell, for you, what is the next big challenge or hurdle?
Yeah, and I think mine's maybe more immediate, more next, and more tactical. You know, literally just weeks ago, we felt this vaccine shortage, and now we're quickly accelerating to higher risk factors, broader eligibility. We are getting ready to face a constraint around distribution capacity. You know, three 3-day mass vaccination sites aren't going to vaccinate 3 million people, and 200 sites aren't going to do that. And now with the government program that's being launched on with Walmart, Kroger, and one other, is going to help. But Indiana will overcome this distribution capacity constraint. What we're going to have most difficulty overcoming is people's willingness to be vaccinated. I mean, this is a small population, and I can't remember, you said 91% answered yes. I'm going on Sunday for mine and can't wait. But we're not going to be able to return to work, return to movie theaters, return to athletic events if half of our employees are vaccinated. And that's just going to drive the risk of these variants and new challenges for us. So it's all of our responsibility to do anything that we can possibly do to maximize the number of people who want to and do get vaccinated. That's the next big challenge. We are not going to be able to go back to normal. We're not going to be able to safely return to work until we cross that hurdle, and it is a high hurdle.
All right. Great point. Great. Well, thank you all again for participating in this very insightful discussion. And I will turn it back over to Patty Martin.
Patty, you're on mute.
There we go. I wish I had, like a penny for every time that was said. But I want to thank our panelists. Erin, thank you for moderating the panel, and for all of you guys for joining. It's very interesting to hear not just about what Indiana has done to support Indiana's rollout of the vaccination and other support related to COVID, but also their impact beyond the state of Indiana, which one thing I thought I would mention in case some of you are not aware of it. Actually yesterday, Baxter down in Bloomington, or actually Moderna, announced that Baxter Healthcare down in Bloomington will be supporting the fill and finish of their vaccination to the tune of 60 to 90 million vials of vaccine. So that adds to the production that Catalent is already doing for both J&J and Moderna. So the only vaccine that's not being touched so far in the state of Indiana with respect to preparation to get it into the supply chain and out to patients is Pfizer's. So we have a huge footprint down in the southern part of Indiana and Bloomington, supporting the global distribution and US distribution. And that's all to the great assets that we have here in Indiana to get connected to other parts of the state, of the states in the world. So with that, what I'd like to do is first, Mark, you can go ahead and post your event if you'd like to promote it. We're happy to support your events and promoting those. In the meantime, I'm just going to hand it over to a quick video that Dr. Chris Box provided to us in support of this discussion.
Hello, I'm State Health Commissioner Chris Box. I'm sorry I can't join you in person today, but I couldn't let the moment pass without acknowledging the incredible work that has been done and continues to be done across the state to help us address the COVID-19 pandemic and get vaccines into Hoosiers' arms. From the beginning of the pandemic a year ago, we have relied heavily on our life sciences community to bring testing, equipment, therapies, and vaccines to Hoosiers to help us in this battle. And now we have to vaccinate 300 million Americans, including more than 5 million here in Indiana, once enough vaccine is available. We're in a race between the variants that are emerging and the vaccine, and we plan for the vaccine to win. The work being done here in Indiana will help us achieve that victory. Now that vaccines are being manufactured and distributed, as you heard today, Indiana is playing an integral role as a center for both the life sciences and for manufacturing and logistics. Indiana has companies that have been involved in clinical trials, the manufacturing of vaccines, the manufacturing of other components like PPE, and the development of software that is helping people make their appointments. Indiana's largest industry sector, advanced manufacturing and logistics, is playing an integral role in collaborating with healthcare technology solutions to ensure the medical supply chain is up to the daunting task of turning vaccines into vaccinations. We have relied on partners ranging from Eli Lilly and our healthcare systems to technology partners like Zotec and the logistics experts at Langham. We are truly blessed to have had such rich resources here in Indiana. As we've discovered throughout the solution, the best solutions are often those grown right here at home. But these strengths don't just benefit Hoosiers navigating this pandemic on the road to getting vaccinated. They benefit people all over the globe. I encourage everyone to turn these vaccines into vaccinations. All 3 vaccines are safe and effective. It's our shot to protect ourselves and keep our loved ones safe. If you're eligible, please visit ourshot.in.gov to find a vaccination site near you. If you don't have access to a computer, call 211 to register.
Wonderful. Thank you everyone again for attending today. Our next Frameworx, we're going to take a break from COVID and vaccines, and we're going to talk about radioisotopes and nuclear medicine. So if you haven't already signed up for our newsletter, you can do that at our website at biocrossroads.com. That's how you'll stay informed about our latest events. And until then, follow us on Twitter. And thanks again to our speakers and everyone who participated today. We look forward to seeing everyone at our next event. Thank you, everyone.